Hello, I'm Ken Robinson, and it's an honour and a pleasure to say a few words of my own to welcome you to the United World Colleges Congress in Trieste in 2016. I'd like to say a special word of thanks before I go on to Ruben Vardanyan and Veronica Zonnebend for their terrific work with the UWC in Dilijan. I'm a great admirer of UWC and the principles for which it's famous and on which it's based. In particular, UWC is collectively committed to fostering forms of education that promote peace and a sustainable future. Really, there are no greater challenges now that we currently face. Our world is more populated than ever, we are more connected than ever, and yet in some ways we're as divided as we ever were. Children are born with immense natural capacities. I see our human resources much like the Earth's natural resources, at least in these respects. They're highly diverse. Conventional education tends to promote a particularly narrow view of human ability, but the truth is, and the evidence all around us is, that we have immense and very varied natural talents. That's why culture is as rich and diverse as it actually is. Secondly, these talents are often buried beneath the surface. They're like the Earth's natural resources in that respect as well. You often have to dig for them. You have to provide opportunities. You have to create circumstances where these resources are revealed. And far too many people, in my experience, go through education without really discovering what their talents are, or indeed sometimes questioning if they have any at all. And the third is that, like the Earth's natural resources, our talents are often presented to us in a raw form. They need to be cultivated. Even when we discover them, they need to be refined, and we need to develop them. And that's also a role for education. There's another respect as well that has always struck me as being important when we think about education and our sense of our children's talents. Children are tremendously and voraciously keen to learn. We are learning organisms. Young children achieve the most extraordinary feats of learning in their very early days. They learn to speak, for example, which in itself is miraculous, and certainly nobody teaches them, and nobody could teach them how to do that. The impulse to learn is natural, but we learn an enormous amount from the people around us. We learn their values, we learn their languages, we learn their traditions, their ways of being. And if we live in closed communities, that's pretty much where our learning is primarily focused. In other words, we learn cultures. Much of what we learn, though learning is natural, much of what we actually learn is cultural in character. Human beings are born with a tremendous sense of compassion. That's been the evidence I've found in my life and all the work I've done. But eventually, culture can begin to divide us. Many of the great conflicts that we face, and have always faced in the world, are cultural in character. And that's still the case now, that even though we're becoming more and more connected, there certainly seems to be a sense in which our technologies are outrunning our sense of compassion and our sense of spirituality and our sense of common belonging. So education has a big job to do in refining these talents, in discovering them in the first place, and enabling people to understand each other's cultures and to look across them and through them to a sense of common humanity. And it's rather urgent that we should do this. I published a book last year. By the way, this book is terrific. I think you should know that. It's called Creative Schools, Revolutionizing Education from the Ground Up. And it's about the need to go back to basics in education. You see, much of what we learn from each other, as I say. I was asked recently whether I thought that there was still a place for schools in education. Well, I believe strongly in schools. Nothing I've ever argued for is against the idea of schools, but I am pretty firmly set against some of the dominant ideas of what schools should be. You see, at its heart, a school is simply a learning community. Any learning community can be a school. A school is a place where people come together to learn with and from each other. It happens over recent years, particularly since the Industrial Revolution. I say recent advisedly because in the great march of time, the Industrial Revolution wasn't so long ago. But since the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of mass systems of education, we've come to associate schools with particular types of characteristics, particular sorts of formal structures, and many of these structures that we have in place in schools are really not to do with the principles of learning, they're to do with principles of organisation and efficiency. And it's why, even though children have a great appetite for learning when they're born, so many of them seem to lose it by the time we start to educate them. There's something in the culture of schools, as they've grown institutionally, which interrupts the natural patterns and appetites to learn. So looking for new forms of schooling based on deeper principles of learning, deeper principles of the sense of community we need to foster among people both who are geographically connected but globally, has honestly never really been more urgent. And we kind of know how to do this. Many of the principles that I've been arguing for in the transformation of education are implicit anyway in the work that the UWC has been doing for a long time. Kurt Hahn and others that preceded him and followed him, both involved in UWC and not, have also promoted the same principles. Let me just mention some of them. The most effective forms of education, I think, are collaborative in character, and that's what UWC promotes. Too often in our schools, we educate children in groups, but not as groups. But learning is a collective enterprise. We compose a common fabric of learning when we work together. And learning and understanding is very much the product of joint adventures among human populations. It's not just a solo performance. So collaborative learning, to me, is the very heart of the transformation we need to be promoting. There's a great emphasis in UWC on learning with and from nature. We've come to believe too often, I think, since the Industrial Revolution, that somehow human beings stand apart from the rest of nature, and nature is reminding us pretty sharply just now that that's not the case. And also, learning doesn't have to happen inside buildings in serried ranks of desks with some person standing at the front telling you what they know. That can be part of education, of course. It's part of the repertory of education. But learning should be more active, more practical. We should be putting ideas into practice, understanding ideas in how they're practiced. That's how cultures have grown and evolved, how our great institutions have evolved, and how many of the great achievements in our understanding of the world within us and the world around us have actually arisen. So the emphasis on activity and not desk learning only is very important. And UWC has always been, from the beginning, a cross-cultural enterprise. It's embedded in the attempt to bring people together from different cultures to work together and to understand each other and to learn from each other. And I think that's a critical feature now of the education systems we need to promote globally. And of course, it's embedded in the approach of the International Baccalaureate, which is also at the heart of what goes on at UWC. But this final characteristic, I just want to mention it in closing, which is that UWC is a global movement, and the education it promotes is global in character. And that is, I think, deeply significant and important. Many of the challenges we face currently are to us as a species. They're not just what's happening in our locale. It's not just what's happening around the corner in our own particular community or what we've come to see as our nation states. Humanity as a whole is facing challenges now which we can only solve if we act collectively and with a common and mutual understanding. One of the people I quoted in Creative Schools was the science fiction writer H.G. Wells, who was writing in the very beginning of the 20th century, facing many of the challenges that have since accelerated, of course: population growth, technological growth, the ways in which we've been negligent in our stewardship of the Earth's resources. And he said, and this is the quote I use, that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. Well, I think he's right, and that's the race we're all engaged in. And we need now to review the tactics and strategies that we're going to pursue if we're to meet these challenges and win this particular race. Fortunately, education is one of those areas where we know many of the answers, where many of the principles are tried and tested. This isn't like trying to cure Ebola or the Zika virus, where we scratch our heads and we're not sure where to start. There are many people who've been in education for a very long time who do know where to start. UWC is among them. Kurt Hahn was among them. Maria Montessori was among them. There are many great educators who have seen the principles, have practiced them for a long time, and our challenge now is to make them truly global and to have them adopted in systems around the world. And that's, I think, what's at issue in the Congress. I think it's what's driven UWC. It's what drives my own work. So welcome. and my very best wishes for all the discussions that lie ahead and the great challenges that we all face that UWC is also engaged in. Thank you very much.